The fluorescent lights of JFK Airport buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across Gate 42. In the chaos of delayed flights and frustrated travelers, nobody noticed the woman in the $1,000 suit collapse to her knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Nobody except the broke electrician with $47 to his name and a sick daughter waiting at home. Some acts of kindness echo through eternity. Some strangers hold the power to reshape entire destinies with a single moment of grace. And sometimes, when the world has beaten you down so far that you're counting pennies for your child's medicine, salvation arrives wearing designer clothes and carrying secrets that could destroy everything you've built. What David Chen didn't know, as he knelt beside that terrified billionaire and talked her through the worst panic attack of her life, was that he just saved Victoria Sterling, owner of a media empire worth $8 billion. What he couldn't have imagined was that she would never forget his face, or that she was about to turn his world upside down. Forever. David Chen's hands shook as he counted the crumpled bills one more time. $47. That was all that stood between him and complete financial collapse. The insulin vial sitting on his kitchen counter cost $68, and Sophie would need a new one in 3 days. The apartment in Phoenix felt smaller than usual this morning, the Arizona sun streaming through windows that desperately needed new blinds. Sophie sat at their second-hand table, carefully checking her blood sugar with the glucose meter they'd managed to keep despite selling almost everything else of value over the past year. "Daddy, it's 140, she announced with the matter-of-fact tone that 8-year-olds used when discussing things that shouldn't be part of childhood vocabulary. "That's good, right?" David forced a smile. "That's perfect, sure, sweetheart. You're getting really good at managing your numbers." Sophie beamed, her dark hair catching the morning light. She'd inherited her mother's delicate features, but thankfully not Linda's inability to cope with life's unexpected challenges. Type 1 diabetes had entered their lives like a tornado 18 months ago, destroying the illusion of financial stability David had worked so hard to build. Linda had lasted exactly 4 months after the diagnosis. 4 months of insulin injections, blood sugar monitoring, midnight emergencies, and medical bills that grew faster than David's modest electrician salary could address. She'd packed her bags on a Tuesday morning while Sophie was at school, leaving behind a note that said she couldn't watch her daughter suffer anymore. What she'd really meant was that she couldn't handle the responsibility, the fear, and the constant reminder that their daughter's life would never be simple. David had found Sophie's stuffed rabbit on Linda's pillow, the only explanation their daughter had received for why Mommy wasn't coming home. The phone rang, jolting David from his dark thoughts. Unknown number, which usually meant creditors these days. "Mr. Chen." The voice was professional but kind. "This is Jennifer from Mountain View Elementary. Sophie's insulin pump is showing a low battery alert. Do you have replacement batteries we should install?" David's stomach dropped. The specialized batteries cost $35. Money he didn't have. I'll bring some by this afternoon." "Of course. And Mr. Chen, we received the notice about Sophie's field trip payment being overdue. The deadline is Friday if you still want her to participate." Another $60 he didn't have. David closed his eyes, calculating rapidly. If he skipped lunch for the rest of the week, if he walked to work instead of driving, if he somehow found odd jobs this weekend, "I'll take care of it," he lied, hating himself for the deception. After hanging up, David looked at his daughter, who was now coloring in a book they'd picked up at the dollar store. She hummed softly to herself, completely unaware that her father was drowning in the impossible mathematics of keeping her alive and healthy. His phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at Thompson Electric. "Funeral approved for tomorrow. Sorry for your loss. Take Wednesday off too if needed. Uncle Ray's funeral in New York." The man who'd helped raise David after his parents died, who'd taught him electrical work, who'd been sending $50 a month until his own health failed. The plane ticket had cost David his last $400 from his emergency fund, money that should have gone to Sophie's medical supplies. But Uncle Ray was the only family David had left, and some obligations transcended financial logic. David knelt beside Sophie's chair, watching her carefully color within the lines of a princess dress. "Sweetheart, Daddy has to go to New York tomorrow for Uncle Ray's funeral. Mrs. Martinez is going to watch you." Sophie looked up with serious brown eyes. "Is Uncle Ray in heaven now?" "I think so. Will you tell him I said hi, and that I'm being brave with my shots?" David's throat tightened. Sophie had never met Uncle Ray, but she understood that he was important to Daddy, and in her 8-year-old logic, that made him worth remembering. "I'll tell him," David promised, kissing the top of her head. "You're the bravest girl I know." That evening, David sat at his laptop in the living room, researching assistance programs he'd already been denied for, clinical trials that might reduce medication costs, anything that might bridge the gap between Sophie's needs and his resources. The math was unforgiving: insulin, test strips, pump supplies, doctor visits, emergency room copays when her blood sugar spiked or crashed. His phone rang again. Dr. Martinez's office. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to follow up on Sophie's appointment next week. Her A1C results came back, and while they're not terrible, I think we should consider adjusting her insulin regimen. It might require more frequent monitoring initially." More monitoring meant more test strips. More test strips meant more money David didn't have. "How much more frequent?" David asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "Testing every 2 hours for the first week. Then we can probably reduce to 4 times daily if her numbers stabilize." David did the math silently. Each test strip cost $1.50. Testing every 2 hours meant 12 strips a day, $18 daily, over $100 a week. "Dr. Martinez, I need to ask, are there any assistance programs for the testing supplies, or maybe a generic alternative?" The pause on the other end told David everything he needed to know. "Mr. Chen, I understand the financial challenges. Let me make some calls and see what options we have. In the meantime, don't reduce her current testing schedule. Sophie's health has to be the priority." After hanging up, David stared at the medical bills spread across his coffee table. $17,000 in outstanding charges. Most of them from the emergency room visits during Sophie's initial diagnosis, when her blood sugar had swung wildly while doctors figured out the right insulin dosages. The collection notices had started arriving last month. Polite but firm letters explaining that payment plans needed to be established, that his credit rating was at risk, that legal action remained a possibility. David had applied for every assistance program he could find, but his income as an electrician put him just slightly above the poverty line. Too much to qualify for aid, too little to actually afford the care his daughter needed. He existed in the cruel gap between help and self-sufficiency, where Sophie's life depended on his ability to perform financial miracles on a daily basis. His laptop screen showed his bank balance, $1,240.33. The plane ticket to New York had cost $440. After Uncle Ray's funeral, he'd have enough money for maybe 2 weeks of Sophie's supplies. And then, David didn't let himself finish that thought. Instead, he opened a new browser tab and began searching for second jobs. Weekend work. Anything that might help him bridge the gap between Sophie's needs and harsh reality. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was an electrician who might soon have his own power shut off for non-payment. Sophie appeared in the living room doorway, wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon pancakes that she'd insisted on because they make me hungry for breakfast. "Daddy, I can't sleep. My tummy feels funny." David immediately switched into medical mode, checking his watch. 8:30 p.m., 2 hours after dinner. He retrieved the glucose meter from the kitchen, gently pricking Sophie's finger and waiting for the reading. 89. He read aloud, lower than ideal, but not dangerously low. "Let's get you a small snack." "Okay." As Sophie nibbled on crackers with peanut butter, David watched her carefully for signs of dropping blood sugar. These moments reminded him why Linda had struggled so much. The constant vigilance, The way every meal and every activity had to be calculated against insulin doses and glucose levels. The terrifying responsibility of keeping another human being's complex chemistry in balance. But David had discovered something Linda couldn't love made the burden bearable. Watching Sophie adapt to her condition with remarkable grace, seeing her help other kids at school understand diabetes, witnessing her matter-of-fact courage during doctor visits. These moments reminded David that they weren't just surviving a medical condition. They were raising an extraordinary human being who happened to need insulin to live. "Daddy," Sophie's voice was small in the quiet kitchen. "Are we going to be okay?" The question hit David like a physical blow. He thought he'd been hiding his stress, protecting her from the adult worries that kept him awake at night. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Mrs. Martinez's daughter has diabetes too, and she heard Mrs. Martinez talking about how expensive everything is. I know my medicine costs a lot of money." David knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his. "Sophie, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your medicine is not something you ever need to worry about. That's Daddy's job. Okay, your job is to be 8 years old, to do well in school, and to take care of yourself the way Dr. Martinez taught you. But what if, no what ifs," David interrupted gently. "I promise you will always have everything you need. That's not something you need to think about." Sophie nodded solemnly, trusting him with the absolute faith that children reserve for their parents. David hoped he could prove worthy of that trust. After Sophie was back in bed, David returned to his laptop and did something he'd been avoiding for weeks. He opened a new tab and searched for personal loan options, payday advance companies, anything that might provide temporary relief, even if it meant borrowing against his already uncertain future. The terms were brutal, interest rates that would trap him in debt for years. But if it meant keeping Sophie healthy while he figured out a longer-term solution? David's phone buzzed with an alert from his bank. His account balance had dropped below $50 due to an automatic payment for Sophie's school lunch program. He closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of his living room. Listening to the hum of the air conditioner, he couldn't really afford to run, and wondering how many other single parents were sitting in similar darkness, making impossible calculations about their children's lives. Tomorrow he would fly to New York for Uncle Ray's funeral. Tomorrow he would say goodbye to the last person who'd helped him believe that everything would work out somehow. And then he would come home and figure out how to keep Sophie alive and healthy for another month. JFK Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos that David remembered from his childhood visits to New York. Uncle Ray had brought him here once when he was 12, pointing out the planes taking off for destinations that seemed impossibly exotic to a kid from Phoenix. Now, at 35, David felt every bit as overwhelmed as that 12-year-old, but for entirely different reasons. The funeral had been small but meaningful. Uncle Ray's neighbors and fellow mechanics sharing stories about a man who'd helped everyone fix everything from broken carburetors to broken hearts. David's flight back to Phoenix was scheduled to depart in 2 hours. Gate 42, a window seat he'd paid extra for, because Uncle Ray had always said airplane windows were free movies if you paid attention to the story outside. As he made his way through the terminal, David's phone buzzed with updates he'd been dreading. 3 text messages from his bank about insufficient funds for automatic payments. 2 voicemails from Sophie's doctor's office about rescheduling her appointment due to insurance issues. 1 missed call from Thompson Electric about a job starting Monday that would require working 6 days a week for the next month. The overtime pay would help, but it also meant longer days away from Sophie, more reliance on Mrs. Martinez's kindness, more guilt about the burden his single parenthood placed on everyone around him. David found a quiet corner near his gate and called Mrs. Martinez to check on Sophie. "She's doing wonderful," Mrs. Martinez assured him in her warm, grandmother voice. "We checked her blood sugar after lunch. 156, very good. She helped me make cookies for my church group, and she measured all the ingredients like a little scientist. Thank you for watching her. I know it's a lot to ask." "David, stop. Sophie is a joy. My Maria loves having her here. You focus on saying goodbye to your uncle properly." After hanging up, David tried to calculate his finances again. The overtime pay from the extended job would cover Sophie's insulin for the next month, but he'd still be short on test strips and pump supplies. He could probably negotiate a payment plan with the medical supply company, but that would mean months of juggling partial payments while accruing late fees. His phone rang. Dr. Martinez's office. Again. Mr. Chen, I have some good news. I spoke with the pharmaceutical representative about Sophie's insulin, and they have a patient assistance program that might cover a significant portion of her costs. I'll need you to fill out some paperwork, but it could reduce your monthly expenses by 60%. David felt his chest loosen for the first time in weeks. That would change everything. I'll email you the forms today. The only requirement is that your income falls below a certain threshold, which, based on our previous conversations, shouldn't be an issue. For the first time in months, David allowed himself to imagine what financial breathing room might feel like. Maybe Sophie could go on that field trip after all. Maybe he could replace the glucose meter that had been giving inconsistent readings. Maybe he could stop making choices between his daughter's health and basic necessities. As he settled into his seat for boarding, David noticed a commotion developing near the gate agent's desk. A woman in an expensive business suit was arguing with airline staff, her voice rising with each exchange. "I need to be on this flight," she was saying, her words clipped with the authority of someone accustomed to having problems solved immediately. "The meeting I'm flying to has been moved up by 3 hours. Ma'am, I understand your urgency, but the flight is completely full. I can put you on the standby list for the next flight in 4 hours. 4 hours is unacceptable. There has to be something you can do." David watched the interaction with the detached interest of someone whose own problems made airline delays seem relatively manageable. The woman appeared to be in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and clothes that probably cost more than David made in a month. Everything about her radiated success and control, except for her hands, which were trembling slightly as she gripped her phone. The gate agent's voice remained professionally calm. "Ma'am, if you'd like to speak with a supervisor—" "Victoria Sterling?" the woman interrupted, as if her name should solve all problems. "I own Sterling Media. This flight delay could cost my company millions in a merger negotiation." David recognized the name vaguely. Sterling Media owns several television networks and newspapers, but even billionaires, apparently, couldn't override the physics of airplane capacity. As boarding began, David noticed that Victoria Sterling had moved away from the gate desk and was standing near the windows overlooking the tarmac. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and her free hand was pressed against her chest in a gesture that David recognized from his own moments of overwhelming stress. "I need the lawyers to delay the meeting," she was saying, her voice carrying despite her obvious attempt to speak quietly. "I don't care what excuse you use. Tell them I had a family emergency." David was settling into his seat when he heard the commotion. Passengers near the gate were murmuring. Someone was calling for security, and a voice over the intercom was asking for medical personnel to respond to Gate 42. Through his window, David could see that Victoria Sterling had collapsed. She was sitting on the floor near the gate, her back against the wall, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps that David recognized immediately. Sophie had experienced similar breathing during her most severe low blood sugar episodes, the kind of respiratory distress that meant someone was in serious trouble. But this didn't look like blood sugar issues. This looked like a panic attack. Airport security was trying to establish a perimeter around Victoria, asking passengers to give her space, but their well-meaning crowd control was probably making her feel more trapped and panicked. David could see her eyes darting around the terminal, wide with the kind of fear that had nothing to do with rational threats. Without really deciding to get involved, David found himself standing up. "Excuse me," he said to the flight attendant. "I think I can help." The flight attendant looked skeptical. "Sir, medical personnel are on their way." "I'm not medical personnel, but I have experience with breathing emergencies. My daughter has a medical condition." David didn't wait for permission. He walked back to the gate area, where Victoria Sterling was surrounded by concerned airline employees who clearly had no idea how to help someone experiencing a psychological crisis. "Ma'am," David said, kneeling down beside Victoria, but maintaining enough distance to avoid making her feel crowded. "My name is David. I'm going to help you get your breathing under control." Victoria's eyes fixed on his face with desperate gratitude. "Can you hear me okay?" David asked, using the same calm tone he'd perfected during Sophie's medical emergencies. Victoria nodded, still unable to speak. "Good. I want you to focus on my voice and ignore everything else. We're going to slow down your breathing together. Ready?" David began the breathing exercise he'd learned from Sophie's diabetes education classes, a technique originally developed for managing medical anxiety, but effective for panic attacks in general. He breathed slowly and audibly, counting out loud, giving Victoria something concrete to focus on. In for 4 counts, hold for 2, out for 6 counts. Within 5 minutes, Victoria's breathing had returned to normal. Her color improved, and the wild panic in her eyes began to subside. "Better?" David asked. "Much," Victoria managed, her voice hoarse. "Thank you. I don't know what happened. I've been traveling for business for 20 years, and I've never—" "Stress has a way of catching up with us when we least expect it," David said gently. "Are you feeling steady enough to stand?" As David helped Victoria to her feet, he noticed that her hands were still shaking, and her grip on his arm was tighter than necessary. Whatever had triggered her panic attack ran deeper than simple travel anxiety. "Can I call someone for you?" David offered. "Family or a friend?" Victoria's laugh was brittle. "There isn't really anyone to call. That's part of the problem." The statement hung between them, revealing more vulnerability than Victoria had probably intended to share with a stranger. Airport medical personnel arrived just as Victoria was regaining her composure, but she waved them off politely, insisting she was fine. David noticed she didn't mention that she'd been having what appeared to be a severe panic attack. "Ma'am, we really should have you checked by a paramedic," the security supervisor insisted. "If you collapsed due to a medical condition—" "I'm fine," Victoria repeated, her business persona sliding back into place like armor. "I simply felt dizzy for a moment. Low blood sugar, probably. I skipped lunch." David almost corrected her. Panic attacks and hypoglycemia presented very differently. But something about Victoria's deliberate misdirection made him hold his tongue. She clearly didn't want her psychological crisis to become part of any official record. "The flight is boarding final passengers," the gate agent announced. David realized he needed to get back to his seat, but something made him hesitate. Victoria Sterling looked composed now, but David had seen enough medical emergencies to recognize when someone was masking ongoing distress. "Are you sure you're okay to travel?" he asked quietly. "Because if you need to postpone your trip—" "I can't postpone it," Victoria said firmly. "This meeting determines whether my company acquires the largest independent television network on the West Coast. Hundreds of jobs depend on this negotiation succeeding." David understood the weight of responsibility that kept people functioning despite their bodies and minds begging for rest. He lived with that pressure every day, pushing through exhaustion and stress because Sophie's health depended on his ability to keep working. "Well," David said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out one of his business cards from Thomson Electric. "If you need someone to call who understands panic attacks, feel free to reach out. I'm not a doctor, but I've learned a lot about managing medical emergencies." Victoria took the card, studying it with more attention than a simple business card usually received. "David Chen, licensed electrician," she read aloud. "Phoenix, Arizona. That's home," David said. "I was here for my uncle's funeral. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. And I'm sorry you're dealing with whatever's causing the stress. I hope your meeting goes well." As David headed back to his seat, he wondered about Victoria Sterling's story. Someone successful enough to own a media empire, but isolated enough to have no one to call during a crisis. Someone whose business responsibilities were so consuming that she was willing to travel while experiencing what appeared to be a significant mental health emergency. During the flight back to Phoenix, David found himself thinking about the contrast between his own problems and Victoria's. He was struggling with financial survival, while she was struggling with what seemed like emotional survival. Both types of crisis could be equally devastating, just in different ways. David's phone had several missed calls when the plane landed in Phoenix, two from Mrs. Martinez, which immediately sent his anxiety spiking. He called back before even collecting his luggage. "David, Sophie is fine," Mrs. Martinez assured him immediately. "But her blood sugar has been running a little high today. 180 after breakfast, 200 after lunch. She feels fine, but I thought you should know." High blood sugar was less immediately dangerous than low blood sugar, but sustained elevations could indicate that Sophie needed an insulin adjustment or that she was developing an illness. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, David said, already calculating whether he had enough test strips to check her blood sugar every hour until her numbers stabilized. As he drove from the airport through familiar Phoenix streets, David thought about Uncle Ray's funeral, about Victoria Sterling's panic attack, about the constant balancing act of single parenthood and financial survival. Uncle Ray used to say that life had a way of connecting people who needed each other, often in ways that weren't immediately obvious. David had always dismissed this as the philosophical musings of a man who'd lived alone too long. But something about his interaction with Victoria Sterling felt significant in a way he couldn't quite define. Maybe it was simply the reminder that everyone struggled with something, regardless of their bank account balance. Or maybe Uncle Ray had been right about life's tendency to weave unexpected connections between strangers who might be able to help each other. 2 weeks after returning from New York, David was running on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination. Sophie's blood sugar had been unstable since his trip, requiring middle-of-the-night monitoring and frequent insulin adjustments. Dr. Martinez had increased her testing schedule to 6 times daily, which meant David was burning through test strips and glucose meters at an unsustainable rate. The overtime job at Thompson Electric was physically demanding, but financially necessary. David was installing new electrical systems in a luxury housing development on the outskirts of Phoenix, working 12-hour days in the desert heat. His body ached constantly, but the extra pay would cover Sophie's insulin for the next 2 months. That morning, Sophie had tested at 89 before breakfast, a good number that allowed David to leave for work without the gnawing worry that had become his constant companion. Mrs. Martinez would check her blood sugar at lunch and text David the results. David was rewiring the master bedroom of a house that would sell for more than he'd earn in 5 years when his phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. "Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Williams from Phoenix Children's Hospital Financial Services. I'm calling about Sophie Chen's account." David's stomach dropped. He'd been trying to negotiate a payment plan for Sophie's recent emergency room visit, but the hospital's payment requirements were beyond his current capabilities. "I understand you're calling about payment arrangements," David said, already calculating which bills he could delay to make a partial payment. "I can probably manage $200 this month." "Actually, Mr. Chen, I'm calling with good news. Sophie's entire outstanding balance has been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor." David nearly dropped his phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "Someone made a payment to completely clear Sophie's account. The payment was made by wire transfer yesterday afternoon. $18,437. David sat down heavily on a stack of electrical conduit, certain he'd misheard. "That's not possible. Who would pay that kind of money?" "The payment came through a law firm representing an anonymous donor. They specifically requested that Sophie's family be contacted to confirm that all medical bills have been cleared and that future care should proceed without any delays due to financial concerns." David stared at his phone, trying to process information that made no sense. $18,000, more money than he could save in 2 years, paid by someone he'd never met for reasons he couldn't understand. "Mr. Chen, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. But there has to be some mistake. People don't just pay strangers' medical bills. According to our records, the payment is legitimate and the funds have cleared. Sophie's account shows a zero balance as of this morning. After hanging up, David sat in the unfinished bedroom, surrounded by electrical supplies and the smell of new construction, trying to understand what had just happened. Anonymous benefactors existed in movies and heartwarming news stories, not in the real life of a struggling single father from Phoenix. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Martinez. Sophie's lunch number was 145. Perfect. She's having a great day at school. David should have felt relief, but instead he felt unsettled. Someone had investigated his family's financial situation deeply enough to know exactly how much money they owed to the hospital. Someone with access to that kind of cash had decided to intervene in their lives without explanation. That evening, David tried to discuss the situation with Sophie over dinner, though he wasn't sure how to explain something he didn't understand himself. "Sweetheart, someone very kind paid for all your hospital visits," David said carefully. "We don't know who it was, but it means Daddy doesn't have to worry about those bills anymore." Sophie looked up from her chicken nuggets with the serious expression she wore when processing adult concepts. "Like a fairy godmother. Maybe something like that. Did you do something nice for them first?" The question stopped David cold. Had he done something nice for someone recently? He tried to think of any recent interactions that might have prompted such extraordinary generosity. The only significant interaction with a stranger had been helping Victoria Sterling with her panic attack at JFK Airport, but that had been a simple human response to someone in distress. And Victoria had hardly seemed like someone who would track down his personal information and anonymously pay his daughter's medical bills. Although, David pulled out his phone and Googled Victoria Sterling net worth. The results were staggering. Estimates range from $7.5 to $8.5 billion. Sterling Media owned television networks, newspapers, and digital media platforms across the country. Victoria Sterling was exactly the kind of person who could write an $18,000 check without thinking twice about it. But why would she? Their interaction had lasted maybe 15 minutes. David had helped her through a panic attack, given her his business card, and wished her well. Nothing about that interaction suggested the beginning of a benefactor relationship. David's phone rang, interrupting his internet research. Dr. Martinez's office. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to follow up on Sophie's recent test results and discuss her care going forward. I understand her hospital account has been cleared." "That's what they told me. I'm still trying to figure out how or why." "Well, whoever arranged it also called our office to establish a medical trust fund for Sophie's ongoing care. The fund will cover all of her diabetes management, insulin, testing supplies, pump equipment, even specialist consultations if needed." David felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. "How much money are we talking about?" The initial deposit was $50,000, with provisions for automatic replenishment as needed. "Mr. Chen, this fund will essentially eliminate any financial barriers to Sophie's medical care for the foreseeable future." $50,000. Added to the hospital payment, someone had just invested nearly $70,000 in his daughter's health. This was beyond generous. This was a life-changing intervention from someone who clearly understood both the costs of chronic illness and the impact of financial stress on families. "Dr. Martinez, do you have any information about who established this fund?" "Only that it came through the same law firm that handled the hospital payment. They were very specific that the donor wishes to remain anonymous, but wants to ensure Sophie receives optimal care without any financial considerations affecting treatment decisions." That night, after Sophie was asleep, David sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, researching everything he could find about Victoria Sterling. Forbes articles about her business acumen, interviews about her media empire's expansion, photos from charity galas where she appeared poised and elegant, but somehow distant. One article from 6 months earlier caught his attention. "Sterling Media CEO takes leave for personal reasons." The piece was brief, mentioning only that Victoria had stepped back from day-to-day operations to address private health matters, while maintaining her role in major strategic decisions. The timeline matched what David had observed at the airport. Victoria's panic attack hadn't seemed like a one-time occurrence. It had the feel of someone struggling with ongoing psychological challenges. David found himself wondering about Victoria's life outside the boardroom. The Forbes estimates of her wealth were mind-boggling, but wealth couldn't cure panic attacks or fill the void she'd mentioned when she said there was no one to call. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Williams from Phoenix Children's Hospital. The donor who established Sophie's medical fund asked me to convey a message. Sometimes good people need help, and sometimes helping them is the only way to find purpose. They hope you'll accept this assistance in the spirit it's intended." David stared at the message, reading it several times. The phrasing felt personal, not like something filtered through lawyers and administrative staff. This felt like a direct communication from someone who understood exactly what David had been struggling with. Someone who knew what it felt like to need help, and someone who had found purpose in providing it. David typed back, "Please tell the donor that my family is incredibly grateful. If there's ever anything I can do to repay this kindness, I hope they'll let me know." The response came within minutes. "The donor says that you already repaid the kindness. They simply hope you'll pass it forward when the opportunity arises." David read the message 3 times, focusing on the phrase, "You already repaid the kindness." This confirmed his suspicion that he'd met his benefactor before receiving their help. The only significant interaction with someone wealthy enough to provide this kind of assistance had been Victoria Sterling. But how had she found him? His business card had included his name and company information, but not his home address or details about Sophie's medical condition. Someone would have had to conduct a fairly thorough investigation to connect him to his daughter's hospital bills. The idea that Victoria Sterling had researched his personal life felt invasive, but the results had been so beneficial that David found it hard to be angry about the privacy violation. Sophie's medical care was secure, his crushing financial stress had evaporated, and for the first time in 18 months, David could make parenting decisions based on what was best for his daughter rather than what he could afford. Over the next few days, David found himself looking at the world differently. The weight of constant financial anxiety had lifted, allowing him to focus on Sophie's emotional and developmental needs rather than survival mode calculations. Sophie noticed the change too. "Daddy, you seem happier," she observed during their nightly reading time. "Are you not worried about my medicine anymore?" "I'm not worried about anything anymore. Sweetheart, someone very kind made sure you'll always have everything you need. I hope I can meet them someday to say thank you." David hoped so too, because whoever Victoria Sterling really was, whatever had motivated her extraordinary generosity, she had given his family something more valuable than money. She had given them the freedom to simply be a father and daughter again, without the constant threat of medical bankruptcy hanging over their relationship. But David also understood that accepting this level of help came with unspoken obligations. The donor's message about passing it forward suggested that this wasn't the end of their story together. Somehow, David suspected Victoria Sterling would find a way to make her presence known again. 3 weeks after the mysterious medical payments, David's life had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Sophie's blood sugar remained stable. Her diabetes supplies arrived automatically from the medical supply company, and Dr. Martinez had been able to implement an optimal treatment plan without any consideration of cost. For the first time since Sophie's diagnosis, David could focus entirely on being her father rather than her financial advocate. That Wednesday morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. "Mr. Chen, this is Grace Thompson from Southwestern Community Development. I'm calling about a position that might interest you." David balanced his phone between his shoulder and ear while checking Sophie's blood glucose levels before school. "I'm not really looking for new employment right now, but thank you for thinking of me. Actually, Mr. Chen, this position was specifically designed with your qualifications in mind. We're building a community center here in Phoenix, and we need a project manager with both electrical expertise and an understanding of family support services." David paused in the middle of preparing Sophie's insulin injection. "I'm sorry, what kind of understanding?" We're creating a comprehensive support center for families dealing with chronic childhood illnesses. The position requires someone who understands both the technical aspects of building maintenance and the real-world challenges these families face. David's hands stilled completely. A job specifically focused on helping families like his own, requiring his exact combination of skills and personal experience. "How did you get my name?" David asked. "You were recommended by someone familiar with your work and your personal dedication to family healthcare advocacy." Another careful non-answer that felt connected to his mysterious benefactor. "I'd be interested in hearing more detail," David said carefully. "Wonderful. Are you available to meet this afternoon? The project is time-sensitive, and we're hoping to fill the position quickly." Grace Thompson's office was located in a gleaming building in downtown Phoenix that smelled like success and possibility. The reception area featured architectural models of community development projects, photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and the kind of professional polish that suggested serious funding behind the organization's work. Grace herself was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a handshake that conveyed both warmth and competence. She led David through a suite of offices that buzzed with purposeful activity. Architects reviewing blueprints, social workers coordinating family services, administrative staff managing what appeared to be multiple large-scale projects. Southwestern Community Development was established 8 months ago, Grace explained as they settled in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Phoenix skyline. "Our founding donor wanted to create something different from traditional charity organizations. Sustainable community infrastructure that addresses root causes rather than just symptoms." David nodded, though he was still trying to understand why this opportunity had found him rather than the other way around. Grace spread architectural plans across the conference table, revealing a project that took David's breath away. The proposed community center was ambitious and thoughtful, with specialized areas for medical support, educational programming, family counseling, and crisis intervention. "Hope Community Center will serve families throughout the greater Phoenix area," Grace continued. "But we're specifically focused on families dealing with chronic childhood illnesses, diabetes, asthma, cancer, genetic conditions, the families who need the most support but often fall through the cracks of existing services." David studied the blueprints with his electrician's eye, automatically cataloging the scope of work involved. New electrical throughout, specialized medical equipment hookups, backup power systems for life support devices, sophisticated security systems for medication storage. "This is a serious undertaking," David said finally. "You're looking at 18 months of construction and a budget in the millions." "Cost isn't our primary concern," Grace replied. "Quality is. We want this done right, by people who understand what these families need, because they live these realities themselves." There it was, the acknowledgement that they knew about Sophie's condition and his personal experience with the healthcare system. "Grace, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "How do you know about my daughter's medical situation, and how did you know I'd be interested in this type of work?" Grace hesitated for just a moment, long enough for David to catch the calculation behind her response. "Your name came highly recommended from someone in the community who was impressed by your character and professional competence. They mentioned that you'd overcome significant personal challenges related to family health care, which makes you uniquely qualified for this position." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. David recognized the same careful phrasing he'd encountered from the hospital in Dr. Martinez's office. "I'd like to know who recommended me." "I'm afraid they asked to remain anonymous, but I can tell you that their assessment of your qualifications was extremely detailed and completely positive." David wanted to push harder, but the project plans in front of him represented something he dreamed about since Sophie's diagnosis: meaningful work that could help families like his own navigate the complex intersection of medical needs and financial reality. What exactly would my role be? Project manager and facility director. You'd oversee the construction phase, then manage day-to-day operations once we're open. The position includes full family health insurance, a competitive salary, and the opportunity to help design programming that directly addresses the challenges you've experienced as a single parent. Grace pulled out a salary proposal that made David's eyes widen. The amount was more than double his current income at Thompson Electric, with benefits that would provide security for Sophie's long-term care needs. "This seems too good to be true," David said honestly. "Why? Because you deserve an opportunity to use your skills in service of something meaningful. Because families like yours should have access to comprehensive support systems. Mr. Chen, there are hundreds of parents in Phoenix dealing with exactly what you've been through. This center can change their lives the same way it could have changed yours 18 months ago." Grace's words hit home because they were absolutely true. If Hope Community Center had existed when Sophie was diagnosed, David's family would have avoided months of financial crisis and medical anxiety. They would have had somewhere to turn for both practical support and emotional guidance. "I need some time to think about it," David said. "Of course, but I should mention that we're hoping to break ground within 6 weeks. We have all the permits approved and funding secured, but we need the right project manager to ensure this gets done properly." As David drove home from the meeting, his mind raced with possibilities and suspicions. The job offer was extraordinary, exactly the kind of opportunity that could transform his family's future, while allowing him to help other families avoid the struggles they'd endured. But the timing, the specific focus on childhood chronic illness, the anonymous recommendation, everything about this opportunity screamed Victoria Sterling's involvement. David found himself wondering if he should be grateful or concerned. On one hand, someone was orchestrating opportunities that aligned perfectly with his skills and values. On the other hand, having his life managed by an unknown benefactor felt unsettling, even when the management resulted in positive outcomes. That evening, David discussed the job offer with Sophie over dinner, though he kept the details age-appropriate. "There's a chance Daddy might get a new job helping families with kids who have diabetes like you do." Sophie brightened immediately. "That would be perfect. You could teach other daddies how to take care of their kids." "Would you like that, if Daddy's work was helping other families?" "Yes, and maybe I could help too. I know lots of things about having diabetes now." Sophie's enthusiasm helped David see the opportunity more clearly. This wasn't just about accepting help from a mysterious benefactor. This was about using his experience to prevent other families from struggling the way they had. His phone buzzed with a text from Grace Thompson. "Mr. Chen, I forgot to mention that the center will include a specialized childcare program for children with chronic conditions. Sophie would always have a safe place to stay during your work hours, with staff trained in medical emergency response." David stared at the message, recognizing another perfectly tailored solution to a problem he'd never mentioned to Grace. Someone had thought through every aspect of his life and designed opportunities that addressed each concern. He typed back, "I'd like to accept the position. When can I start?" The response came immediately. "Wonderful. Can you begin Monday? We're excited to have you as part of the Hope Community Center family." As David tucked Sophie into bed that night, he reflected on the dramatic changes in their lives over the past month. From financial desperation to medical security to a career opportunity that felt custom designed for his situation. "Daddy," Sophie's voice was sleepy but thoughtful, "do you think the person who helped pay for my medicine is the same person who wants you to help other families?" David considered the question seriously. "What makes you think that?" "Because it seems like something the same nice person would do. Help us first, then help us help other people." Sophie's logic was simple but probably accurate. Someone had invested significant resources in their family's stability and was now creating opportunities for David to extend that stability to others. "I think you might be right, sweetheart. I hope we get to meet them someday. I want to say thank you and show them that their help worked." David hoped so too, because whoever Victoria Sterling really was, whatever had motivated her to intervene in their lives, she had created something beautiful from what could have been a devastating situation. But David also suspected that Monday's new job would bring him closer to understanding his benefactor's identity and motivations. And he was right. David's first week as project manager for Hope Community Center Felt like stepping into a dream designed specifically for his skills and passions. The construction site hummed with purposeful activity. Electricians, plumbers, carpenters, and specialty contractors working together to transform an empty building into something that would change families' lives. Grace Thompson had introduced David to the construction team as someone who understood the mission from personal experience, and the workers responded with a level of commitment that suggested they'd been briefed on the project's importance beyond typical construction jobs. The building itself was a former medical facility, which meant much of the basic infrastructure could be adapted rather than built from scratch. David's electrical background proved invaluable as he coordinated the installation of specialized power systems for medical equipment, backup generators for emergency situations, and sophisticated security systems for medication storage. But the most impressive aspect of the project was the thoughtful design. Every room, every hallway, every piece of equipment had been chosen with families' real needs in mind. The children's area included spaces for blood glucose testing that felt more like cozy reading nooks than medical stations. The family consultation rooms were designed to accommodate wheelchairs, medical equipment, and emotional conversations without feeling clinical or institutional. Someone had clearly spent significant time researching the practical challenges faced by families dealing with chronic childhood illnesses. That Thursday afternoon, David was reviewing electrical specifications with his installation crew when Grace approached with a woman he didn't recognize. "David, I'd like you to meet V. Stone, our consulting specialist from Sterling Foundation. She'll be working with us to ensure the center meets all operational standards." David looked up from his blueprints and felt a shock of recognition. V. Stone was Victoria Sterling. She wore jeans and work boots that looked expensive but practical. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the severe business style he remembered from the airport. But her eyes were unmistakable, intelligent, assessing, and currently watching David's face carefully for his reaction. "Mr. Chen," Victoria said, extending a hand that was softer than any contractor's he'd ever shaken. "Grace has told me wonderful things about your work here." David accepted her handshake, noting that her grip was steady despite the slight tremor he remembered from JFK Airport. She was clearly managing her anxiety better, but the underlying tension remained. "Ms. Stone," David replied, deciding to follow her lead in maintaining the fiction of their first meeting. "Are you with the Sterling Foundation?" "In a consulting capacity, I represent some of the donors who are particularly interested in this project's success." Grace excused herself to handle a call, leaving David and Victoria alone among the construction noise and equipment. "Should I call you V, or would you prefer Ms. Stone?" David asked quietly. "V is fine," Victoria replied, and David caught the slight smile that suggested she appreciated his discretion. For the next hour, Victoria toured the construction site with the focused attention of someone who understood both the technical requirements and the human needs the center would serve. She asked intelligent questions about accessibility features, emergency power systems, and the specialized air filtration needed for children with respiratory conditions. "The medical consultation rooms," Victoria said, studying the architectural plans. "They're designed to accommodate telehealth equipment. Yes, state-of-the-art systems that will allow families to consult with specialists who might be hundreds of miles away," David replied. "Especially important for families who can't afford to travel for specialized care," Victoria nodded approvingly. "And the medication storage area, temperature-controlled, secured access, backup power systems, and direct communication with the local pharmacy for emergency supplies. What about families who can't afford their medications?" David paused, recognizing the personal investment behind the question. "The center will maintain an emergency medication fund for exactly those situations. No child should go without life-saving medications because of financial limitations." Victoria's smile was radiant. "That's exactly right." As they continued the tour, David found himself studying Victoria's interactions with the construction crew. She spoke knowledgeably about building systems and safety requirements, But there was something more personal in her engagement with this project. When they reached the area designated for the Children's Emergency Care Station, Victoria stopped and stared at the space for several minutes. "This room," she said finally, "it's designed for children with diabetes. Among other conditions, the idea is to have trained medical staff available for emergencies, but in a setting that feels safe and comfortable rather than clinical." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Children shouldn't have to be afraid of their medical care. There was something in her tone that made David look at her more carefully. This wasn't professional interest. This was deeply personal connection to the challenges faced by chronically ill children. "V, can I ask you something?" "Of course. You seem to understand these children's experiences very well. Do you have personal experience with chronic childhood illness?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, clearly deciding how much truth to share. "I had a daughter once," she said finally. "Not biological, but mine in every way that mattered. She had type 1 diabetes." David felt his understanding of Victoria's motivations shift completely. "Had she died when she was 9, 23 years ago, but it still feels like yesterday." The raw pain in Victoria's voice explained everything. The anonymous payments for Sophie's care, the perfectly designed community center, the focus on families dealing with exactly the challenges Victoria had once faced. "I'm so sorry," David said, meaning it completely. "Her name was Emma. She was in foster care when I met her. I was 28, just starting to build my media company, and I thought I could provide her with everything she needed. I had money for the best doctors, the latest medical technology, all the resources that should have made her condition manageable." Victoria paused, clearly struggling with memories that remained painful decades later. But money couldn't fix a system that failed children like Emma. Her foster family before me had rationed her insulin because they couldn't afford the copays. By the time I found her, the damage was already done. I had her for 18 months, the best 18 months of my life, but her body had already been compromised by months of inadequate care. David understood now why Victoria had been so generous with Sophie's medical fund, why the community center was designed with such thoughtful attention to diabetic children's needs. "Emma would have loved this place," Victoria continued, gesturing around the construction site. "She always said she wanted to help other kids like her when she grew up. In a way, I guess she is. Is that why you helped my family? Because Sophie reminded you of Emma?" Victoria met his eyes directly. "I helped your family because you reminded me that good people still exist. When you helped me at the airport, you didn't know who I was or what I could do for you. You simply saw someone who needed help and provided it. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have called for medical help and stayed out of the situation. You got personally involved because someone was in distress, and you had the skills to help them." Victoria gestured around the construction site. "This center exists because you showed me that there are still people who help without calculating personal benefit. Emma would have loved you, and she would have loved Sophie." David felt something shift in his understanding of his relationship with Victoria Sterling. This wasn't about charity or philanthropy. This was about someone who had experienced devastating loss, finding a way to prevent other families from enduring the same tragedy. "Would you like to meet Sophie?" David asked impulsively. "She's been curious about the fairy godmother who helped with her medical bills." Victoria's face lit up with genuine joy. "I would love that. If you think she'd be comfortable meeting a stranger?" "Sophie has never met a stranger. And somehow, I don't think you'll be a stranger to her for long." As they concluded the construction site tour, David realized that his mysterious benefactor was no longer mysterious. Victoria Sterling was simply a woman who had loved a child and lost her, and who was now using her resources to ensure that other families didn't face the same preventable tragedy. "V," David said as they walked back toward the site office. "Yes. Thank you for Sophie, for this job, for creating something that will help so many families. I understand now why you did it, and I'm grateful Emma had someone who loved her so much." Victoria stopped walking and looked at David with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for letting me help," she said. "For the first time in 23 years, I feel like Emma's life meant something beyond my own grief." "Her life means everything," David replied, "because it led to this center, which will save hundreds of children like her." As Victoria drove away from the construction site that afternoon, David stood among the building materials and electrical equipment, understanding that he was part of something much larger than a construction project. He was helping to build Emma's legacy, and somehow, he suspected that both Emma and Sophie would approve. 6 weeks into construction, Hope Community Center was ahead of schedule and exceeding every expectation David had imagined. The medical consultation rooms were equipped with technology that rivaled major hospitals. The children's areas felt warm and welcoming, despite their sophisticated monitoring capabilities. And the family support spaces were designed to provide both privacy and community. Victoria had become a regular presence at the construction site, though she maintained her Vorst-her-Stone identity with everyone except David. Her expertise in project management and her genuine care for operational details impressed the entire construction crew. But David was the only one who understood the personal investment driving her involvement. Sophie had been visiting the site regularly, fascinated by the transformation taking place and excited about the possibility of helping other children like herself. Victoria and Sophie had developed an easy friendship, with Victoria often bringing age-appropriate books about construction, medical heroes, and community helpers. David watched their interactions with growing wonder. Victoria's entire demeanor changed around Sophie. The controlled businesswoman disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely delighted by an 8-year-old's questions and observations. Sophie, for her part, treated Ms. V like a favorite aunt who happened to know interesting things about building projects and medical equipment. That Tuesday started like any other construction day, with David arriving early to coordinate the electrical team's work on the emergency power systems. The weather forecast had mentioned possible afternoon storms, but Arizona's monsoon season often produced dramatic predictions that resulted in minimal actual weather. By noon, however, the sky had darkened ominously, and the wind was picking up in ways that made the construction crew nervous. "Boss," called Tommy, David's lead electrician, "we should probably secure the equipment and call it a day. This looks like it could get nasty." David checked his phone's weather app, which now showed severe thunderstorm warnings with possible tornado activity, unusual for Phoenix, but not unprecedented during monsoon season. "Pack it up," David decided. "Everyone go home and make sure your families are secure." As the crew began securing equipment and covering exposed electrical work, David called Mrs. Martinez to check on Sophie. "David, we're fine here," Mrs. Martinez assured him. "Sophie's numbers have been perfect today, and we're staying inside with plenty of activities. How's the construction site? We're shutting down early because of the storm warnings. I'll probably be home within the hour." "Good, this weather is making everyone nervous." David was overseeing the final equipment securing when Victoria's car pulled into the parking lot. She climbed out wearing a raincoat and boots, clearly intending to inspect the storm preparations personally. "V, you don't need to be here," David called over the increasing wind. "We've got everything covered." "I wanted to make sure the medical equipment storage was properly protected," Victoria replied, jogging toward the building entrance. "Some of that equipment is irreplaceable and extremely sensitive to humidity." They made their way through the building together, checking that windows were secured, medical equipment was covered, and emergency power systems were functioning properly. The storm was intensifying rapidly, with rain beginning to slam against the windows and wind howling through gaps in the construction barriers. Victoria's phone rang as they finished securing the medication storage area. "Patricia, I can barely hear you," Victoria said, pressing her phone against her ear. "What's the emergency?" David watched Victoria's face change from calm professionalism to alarm. "What do you mean the Phoenix market is collapsing? What happened to the Sterling Industries stock price?" Victoria moved to a quieter corner of the building, but David could still hear fragments of her conversation. "Down 40% in 2 hours?" That's impossible. What do you mean, fraudulent reporting accusations? Who's making these allegations? David realized he was witnessing a major business crisis unfolding in real time. Victoria Sterling's media empire was apparently under some kind of financial attack, and she was trying to manage the crisis from a construction site during a severe storm. Patricia, I need you to conference me into the emergency board meeting immediately, Victoria was saying, her voice taking on the authoritative tone David associated with her public persona. And get our legal team on the line with securities regulators. The call continued for 20 minutes, with Victoria pacing the length of the building while coordinating what sounded like a complex response to corporate sabotage. David couldn't help but admire her composure under pressure. She was simultaneously managing a media empire crisis and ensuring that construction equipment remained protected from storm damage. But David also noticed signs of the anxiety he'd first witnessed at JFK Airport. Victoria's free hand was pressed against her chest. Her breathing was becoming shallower, and her pacing was taking on the restless quality that suggested rising panic. When Victoria finally ended the call, she stood motionless for several minutes, staring out at the storm through rain-streaked windows. "How bad is it?" David asked quietly. "Someone's been spreading false information about Sterling Industries' financial reporting, trying to trigger a stock market panic that would force us into a vulnerable position for a hostile takeover." Victoria's voice was steady, but David could see the tremor in her hands that indicated her anxiety was escalating. "Is it working?" "They caught us at exactly the right moment. The board is scattered across 3 time zones. Our legal team is handling 2 other crises, and the stock market is reacting to rumors faster than we can provide documentation to disprove them." Victoria's breathing was becoming more rapid, and David recognized the early signs of the panic attack he'd helped her through at the airport. "V, you need to sit down and focus on breathing," David said gently, guiding her to a chair in what would become the family consultation area. "I can't have a panic attack right now," Victoria said, pressing both hands against her chest. "My company is under attack, and hundreds of employees depend on me to handle this crisis." "Which is exactly why you need to get your breathing under control first," David replied, kneeling beside her chair. "Remember the technique we used at the airport?" As Victoria began the breathing exercises David guided her through, her phone rang again. She looked at the caller ID and groaned. "It's my mother. She must have seen the news reports about Sterling Industries." "Do you want to answer it?" "No, but if I don't, she'll assume the worst and call every business reporter she knows looking for information." Victoria answered the call, but David could immediately tell that her mother's response to the crisis was increasing rather than decreasing Victoria's stress level. "Mother, I can't discuss confidential business strategies over the phone," Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "The situation is being handled by our legal and financial teams." David could hear a sharp female voice on the other end of the call, though he couldn't make out the specific words. "No, Mother, this isn't the result of my emotional instability. This is corporate warfare, and it has nothing to do with my personal mental health." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Victoria's mother apparently expressing concerns about Victoria's ability to handle business crises while dealing with anxiety disorders. By the time Victoria hung up, her breathing was shallow again, and her hands were shaking visibly. "Family support in times of crisis?" David asked with gentle irony. "My mother believes that successful business leadership requires emotional invulnerability," Victoria replied, her voice bitter. "She's convinced that my anxiety disorder makes me unfit to run a media empire." "What do you think?" Victoria looked at David with surprise, as if no one had ever asked for her opinion about her own capabilities. "I think my anxiety makes me more empathetic to other people's struggles, not less capable of handling business challenges. But the board of directors doesn't necessarily agree." David's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Mrs. Martinez. "David, Sophie's blood sugar dropped to 67. I gave her juice and crackers. But I think you should come home. The storm is getting worse, and she's feeling scared." David's parental instincts immediately shifted into high gear. Sophie's blood sugar was dropping into the range that could become dangerous quickly, especially if stress and fear were affecting her body's glucose regulation. "I need to get home," David said, showing Victoria the text. "Sophie's having blood sugar issues." Victoria immediately stood up, her corporate crisis momentarily forgotten. "How far do you live from here?" "About 15 minutes in normal weather, but with this storm, my car has all-wheel drive and GPS navigation. Let me drive you." "V, you've got your own emergency to handle. My emergency is corporate politics. Yours is a child who needs medical attention. There's no comparison." As they ran through the parking lot to Victoria's car, the storm reached its peak intensity. Rain was coming down in sheets. Wind was strong enough to make walking difficult, and the sky had taken on the greenish tint that often preceded tornado activity in Arizona. Victoria drove with calm confidence through conditions that would have challenged any driver, her expensive sedan handling the flooded streets and debris-scattered roads without difficulty. But David noticed that her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and she was breathing with the deliberate rhythm that suggested ongoing anxiety management. "V, are you okay to drive in this?" "I'm fine. Sophie needs to get home safely." David's phone rang. "Mrs. Martinez again." "David, Sophie's blood sugar came back up to 89, but now she's asking for you. She's worried about the storm, and I think the stress is affecting her glucose levels." "We're 5 minutes away," David replied, relief flooding through him. As Victoria navigated the final turn onto David's street, her phone rang with what sounded like an urgent ringtone. "I should answer that," Victoria said, glancing at the caller ID. "It's my head of legal affairs." "Patricia, what's the latest?" Victoria answered, putting the call on speaker so she could focus on driving. "Victoria, we need you to authorize the release of financial documentation that will disprove the allegations, but it requires your personal signature on disclosure agreements." "Where do I need to be?" "Ideally, our downtown office within the next 2 hours. The markets close in 4 hours, and if we can't provide documentation by then, the stock price could drop below the threshold that triggers automatic board review of your position as CEO." David understood the implications immediately. Victoria was facing the possibility of losing control of her own company because of false allegations, and the window for response was narrowing rapidly. "Victoria, I can handle things from here," David said as they pulled into his driveway. "You need to go save your company." "I'm not leaving until I know Sophie is okay." Victoria insisted on coming inside to check on Sophie personally. Despite the urgency of her corporate crisis, Mrs. Martinez greeted them with relief, and Sophie ran to David with the combination of excitement and residual worry that followed her blood sugar episodes. "Daddy, Miss V, the storm is so loud, and my tummy felt funny, but Mrs. Martinez gave me juice, and now I feel better." Victoria knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her business crisis apparently forgotten. "Are you feeling strong now?" Victoria asked, gently checking Sophie's hands for signs of lingering hypoglycemia. "Yes, but I was scared because the thunder was really loud, and my blood sugar machine beeped a lot." "Thunder can be scary, but you did exactly the right thing by telling Mrs. Martinez how you felt. That's what brave girls do." Sophie beamed at the praise, then looked at Victoria with sudden concern. "Ms. V, are you okay? You look worried." Victoria glanced at David, clearly torn between her affection for Sophie and the crisis demanding her attention. "I'm handling some grown-up problems, sweetheart, but they'll get figured out." Sophie's 8-year-old logic kicked in immediately. "Is someone being mean to you because Daddy always says that mean people can't win if good people stick together?" Victoria's smile was radiant despite her stress. "That's exactly right, Sophie, and you've helped remind me that good people do stick together." Victoria's phone was ringing again, but she ignored it to give Sophie a proper hug goodbye. "Ms. V," Sophie said seriously, "I hope your grown-up problems get fixed, and if you need help, Daddy's really good at fixing things." As Victoria prepared to leave for her downtown office, David walked her to the car. V, good luck with the board meeting, and thank you for driving me home. David, I need to tell you something before I go handle this crisis. Victoria looked directly into his eyes, and David saw vulnerability there that had nothing to do with corporate politics. What is it? If this takeover attempt succeeds, if I lose control of Sterling Industries, the funding for Hope Community Center could be jeopardized. The foundation that's funding the project is directly tied to my company's financial stability. David felt his stomach drop. How jeopardized? Worst-case scenario, construction would have to stop immediately, and the center might never open. David understood the implications immediately. Dozens of families were counting on Hope Community Center services. His own career had been restructured around the project, and Sophie's childcare arrangements were designed around his work at the center. Is there anything I can do to help? Victoria shook her head. This is corporate warfare, and it has to be fought with lawyers and financial documentation, not construction expertise. But as Victoria drove away into the storm, David realized there might be more he could do than she understood. Because sometimes the most important battles were fought with community support rather than corporate strategies. And David was about to discover just how powerful that community could be. David spent that evening making phone calls while monitoring Sophie's blood sugar and listening to storm updates on the local news. The corporate attack on Sterling Industries was major enough to warrant coverage on Phoenix television stations, with business reporters speculating about the potential impact on Victoria's media empire and related business ventures. What the reporters didn't know was how the corporate crisis might affect a half-built community center that hundreds of families were counting on. David's first call was to Grace Thompson. Grace, I know it's late, but I need to understand our funding situation if Sterling Industries faces financial difficulties. Grace's pause told David everything he needed to know. David, I was planning to call you first thing tomorrow morning. The foundation's lawyers are reviewing our construction contracts to understand what protections we have if the primary funding source becomes unavailable. How bad could it get if Sterling Industries' stock price drops below certain thresholds? Or if Victoria Sterling loses her position as CEO, the foundation might lose access to the funds that are supporting our project. We could be looking at immediate construction suspension. David felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had plagued him before Victoria's intervention in his family's financial crisis. Grace, how many families are counting on this center opening on schedule? 347 families have already enrolled for services. Many of them have rearranged their health care, employment, and childcare around our projected opening date. 347 families like David's own, dealing with chronic childhood illnesses and the complex challenges that accompanied them. Families who needed Hope Community Center to provide stability and support that wasn't available anywhere else in Phoenix. David made a decision that felt both crazy and inevitable. Grace, I want to organize community support for Victoria Sterling, not for her company, but for the center. If 300 families publicly demonstrate their support for this project, it might influence how the media covers the corporate crisis. David, I appreciate the sentiment, but corporate takeover battles aren't usually influenced by community organizing. Maybe they should be. David's second call was to Dr. Martinez. Doctor, I need your help with something that might sound unusual. David explained the situation. The corporate attack on Sterling Industries, the potential threat to Hope Community Center's funding, and his idea for organizing community support. Mr. Chen, are you asking me to get politically involved in a business dispute? I'm asking you to advocate for a medical facility that will serve hundreds of children with chronic conditions. This isn't about corporate politics. This is about community health care. Dr. Martinez was quiet for several minutes. How many families are we talking about? Everyone who's enrolled for center services, plus everyone who's applied for enrollment, plus everyone who could benefit from these services but hasn't heard about them yet. Maybe 1,000 families total. And your plan is what exactly? David took a deep breath, knowing his next words would commit him to something ambitious and possibly impossible. Tomorrow morning, I want to organize a demonstration at Sterling Industries' Phoenix office. Not a protest against anyone, but a show of support for Victoria Sterling and the Community Center project. I want local families to explain publicly why this center matters to them. David, do you have any experience organizing public demonstrations? No, but I have experience with impossible situations, and sometimes you have to try things that seem crazy because the alternatives are unacceptable. Dr. Martinez agreed to contact families from her patient roster who might be interested in supporting the demonstration. She also offered to provide medical volunteers who could monitor children with chronic conditions during the event. David's third call was to Tommy, his lead electrician. Boss, what's up? Are we working tomorrow despite the weather? Tommy, I need to ask you and the crew for a personal favor that goes beyond your construction contract. David explained the situation and his plan for community support. So let me get this straight, Tommy said slowly. You want the construction crew to participate in a public demonstration supporting our employer during a corporate crisis that could result in our project being canceled. That's exactly what I'm asking. Boss, count me in. This project is the most important work I've done in 15 years of construction. If there's a chance to save it, I'm interested. By 10 p.m., David had commitments from Dr. Martinez to contact medical families, Grace Thompson to provide logistical support, Tommy to organize construction worker participation, and Mrs. Martinez to help coordinate childcare during the demonstration. David's phone rang at 11 p.m., Victoria's name on the caller ID. David, I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all. How did the board meeting go? Victoria's voice was exhausted but determined. We provided enough documentation to slow down the stock price collapse, but the situation is still critical. The board is meeting again tomorrow morning to decide whether to accept a buyout offer that would essentially dissolve Sterling Industries as an independent company. What does that mean for the foundation and the community center? It means tomorrow might be the last day I have the authority to protect the project's funding. David took a deep breath. Victoria, I need to tell you about something I've organized for tomorrow morning. David explained his plan for community demonstration, the families who had committed to participate, and his hope that public support might influence the corporate crisis resolution. Victoria was quiet for a long time. David, I appreciate the gesture more than you know, but corporate takeover battles aren't influenced by public relations campaigns. Maybe this one will be different. Maybe when people understand what's at stake beyond stock prices and corporate control, they'll care about different outcomes. What do you mean? I mean, when local news covers this story, they won't just be reporting on Sterling Industries' financial problems. They'll be reporting on families whose children's health care depends on your company's stability. They'll be talking about a community center that could change hundreds of lives. Victoria's voice was soft when she responded. You're organizing this demonstration to support me. I'm organizing it to support Emma's legacy and Sophie's future, and every family who needs what Hope Community Center represents. David, even if the demonstration is successful, even if it influences media coverage of the crisis, there's no guarantee the board will decide to reject the buyout offer. I know, but sometimes you have to try impossible things because not trying guarantees failure. Victoria was quiet again. What time is the demonstration? 9 a.m. outside Sterling Industries' Phoenix office building. I'll be there. Victoria, you'll be in board meetings all morning. The board meeting doesn't start until 10 a.m. I'll have time to see what the community support looks like. The next morning dawned clear and bright. With yesterday's storm having passed through completely, David arrived at Sterling Industries' downtown Phoenix office building at 7:30 a.m. to find that word of the demonstration had spread beyond his initial organizing efforts. Grace Thompson was coordinating with building security to ensure the demonstration remained peaceful and legal. Dr. Martinez had set up a medical support station for participating families. Tommy and the construction crew were distributing flyers explaining Hope Community Center's mission and the potential impact of the corporate crisis. By 8:30, over 200 people had gathered in the plaza outside Sterling Industries' office building. Families with children, construction workers, medical professionals, and community members who had heard about the demonstration through social media and local news coverage. Local television stations were setting up cameras, and reporters were interviewing families about why they were supporting Victoria Sterling during her company's crisis. David watched a mother 6 months later. David Chen stood in the main hall of Hope Community Center, watching his daughter Sophie teach a group of newly diagnosed diabetic children how to check their blood sugar without fear. The late afternoon Phoenix sun streamed through windows that had been installed by his own hands, illuminating faces filled with hope instead of desperation. Victoria Sterling, no longer hiding behind the alias V. Stone, sat cross-legged on the floor beside them, her billion-dollar empire secure, her panic attacks managed, but more importantly, her heart finally full. The corporate crisis had passed. The hostile takeover had failed, but what remained was something neither money nor power could have purchased. A family, built from broken pieces. 347 families now had access to the care they needed. Thousands more would follow. Emma's legacy lived on in every child who would never have to ration insulin, never have to choose between medicine and rent, never have to watch their parents count pennies for their survival. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as coincidence. Sometimes guardian angels have panic attacks in airport terminals. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is help a stranger breathe. What act of unexpected kindness changed the course of your life forever?